What if I told you that in 1923, a brilliant physicist managed to capture human shadows in glass bottles? What if I told you those shadows were still moving, still whispering, 60 years after the man who trapped them had vanished without a trace? Tonight, we dive into the forgotten files of Dr. Erasmus Blackwood, a man whose obsession with light and darkness led him down a path that science refuses to acknowledge. A path that ended with 17 glass bottles containing what witnesses described as writhing shadows that spoke in voices no living person had ever heard. This is not just a story about scientific curiosity gone wrong. This is a story about a man who discovered that shadows aren't merely the absence of light. They're something far more ancient, far more alive than anyone dared imagine. Dr. Erasmus Blackwood wasn't always obsessed with darkness. In 1915, he was Cambridge University's most promising young physicist, specializing in the properties of light. His colleagues described him as brilliant but eccentric, a man who would spend hours staring at his own shadow on laboratory walls, muttering calculations under his breath. The obsession began after a laboratory accident in 1918. While experimenting with a new type of photographic plate, Blackwood claimed he had captured something impossible: a photograph of a shadow that moved independently of its caster. The image showed his assistant, Thomas Hartwell, standing perfectly still. But his shadow appeared to be reaching toward something outside the frame. Hartwell died 3 days later under mysterious circumstances. His body was found in the laboratory, completely drained of color, not just pale, but as if all pigmentation had been leached from his skin, hair, and eyes. The official cause of death was listed as sudden cardiac failure, but those who saw the body whispered of something far stranger. Blackwood became convinced that shadows were not mere optical phenomena, but living entities tethered to human souls. He theorized that every person cast not one shadow, but multiple shadows across different planes of existence, and that under the right conditions, these shadows could be separated from their hosts. By 1920, Blackwood had abandoned traditional physics entirely. He transformed his private laboratory into something that resembled a medieval alchemist's workshop more than a modern scientific facility. Mirrors lined every surface, positioned at precise angles to create what he called shadow corridors. Strange devices hummed in the darkness, machines of his own design that he claimed could weave light and shadow into new configurations. His first successful shadow extraction occurred on the winter solstice of 1921. The subject was a volunteer from the local workhouse, a man named Edmund Crowe, who had agreed to participate in exchange for a substantial payment. Witnesses described the procedure as horrifying to observe. Crowe was positioned at the center of Blackwood's mirror array while the doctor manipulated his light-weaving machines. As the apparatus hummed to life, observers reported that Crowe's shadow began to stretch and distort, moving in ways that defied the laws of physics. The shadow appeared to struggle, writhing like a living thing, trying to escape its fate. Then came the moment of separation. Witnesses described hearing a sound like tearing silk, followed by Crowe's agonized scream. His shadow peeled away from his body like wet paint, flowing across the floor toward a specially prepared glass container. The shadow fought against the containment, pressing against the glass walls like a caged animal. But Blackwood's apparatus held firm. The procedure was a success, but at a terrible cost. Edmund Crowe survived the extraction, but he was fundamentally changed. He cast no shadow from that day forward, and those who knew him said his personality had been completely altered. Where once he had been jovial and talkative, he became silent and withdrawn. His eyes held a hollow quality that made people uncomfortable, as if they were looking into empty sockets rather than living organs. But it was the shadow itself that truly disturbed those who witnessed the experiment. Trapped in its glass prison, the shadow moved with apparent intelligence, pressing against the walls, tracing patterns that almost resembled writing. Most unsettling of all, it seemed to whisper, a sound so faint it was barely audible, but unmistakably present. Word of Blackwood's success spread through certain circles, attracting the attention of wealthy individuals who were fascinated by the They began commissioning shadow extractions, paying enormous sums to experience what Blackwood called the ultimate separation of self. Over the next 2 years, Blackwood performed 16 more extractions. Each procedure followed the same pattern. The subject would lose their shadow permanently, undergo a dramatic personality change, and their extracted shadow would join the growing collection of bottled entities in Blackwood's laboratory. The shadows themselves became increasingly active as their numbers grew. Visitors to the laboratory reported that the bottles would warm to the touch, and the shadows within would react to human presence by pressing against the glass and increasing the intensity of their whispered communications. Some claimed they could make out words in languages that didn't exist, while others insisted the shadows were sharing memories of places no living person had ever seen. Blackwood documented everything in meticulous detail, filling notebook after notebook with observations about shadow behavior, theories about the nature of separated souls, and increasingly disturbing speculation about what the shadows were trying to communicate. His handwriting became more erratic as time passed, and his notes began to include passages that seemed to be written in response to the shadows. Whispers. The end came suddenly. In March of 1923, Blackwood's housekeeper arrived at the laboratory one morning to find the building in chaos. Every mirror had been shattered from the inside. The light-weaving machines were destroyed, and 17 glass bottles sat empty on their shelves. Of Dr. Blackwood himself, there was no trace, no body, no note, no explanation for his disappearance. But perhaps most disturbing of all, the housekeeper reported that the laboratory cast no shadows. Despite the morning sunlight streaming through the windows, despite the furniture and equipment that should have blocked the light, the room existed in a state of uniform illumination, as if shadows themselves had been banished from the space. The local authorities conducted a brief investigation, but the case was quickly closed due to lack of evidence. Blackwood's research notes were confiscated by unknown parties, and the laboratory was sealed. Within a year, the building had been demolished, and an official story was circulated claiming that Blackwood had suffered a nervous breakdown and been committed to an asylum under an assumed name. But the story doesn't end there. Over the decades that followed, there were persistent reports of strange phenomena in the area where Blackwood's laboratory once stood. Visitors claimed to see figures moving in their peripheral vision, human-shaped forms that cast no shadows and vanished when observed directly. Photographers working in the area found that their images contained unexplained dark spots and flowing shapes that hadn't been visible to the naked eye. More disturbing were the reports of missing shadows. People who spent time in the area sometimes discovered that they had lost their shadows entirely, experiencing the same personality changes that had affected Blackwood's original subjects. They became quiet, withdrawn, and spoke of hearing whispers in languages they couldn't understand. In 1987, a construction crew working on a new building in the area made a discovery that was quickly suppressed by local authorities. While digging the foundation, they uncovered a cache of 17 glass bottles buried deep in the earth. The bottles appeared to be empty, but workers reported that they felt warm to the touch and seemed to vibrate with an internal energy. The bottles were removed by officials who refused to identify themselves, and the construction workers were sworn to secrecy. However, one worker later broke his silence, claiming that as the bottles were being loaded into a vehicle, he had seen movement within the glass, dark shapes that twisted and writhed as if they were still alive. So what happened to Dr. Erasmus Blackwood? Did he achieve the ultimate separation of self, becoming one with the shadows he had spent years studying? Or did his experiments unleash something that had been better left undisturbed? The truth is, we may never know. Official records of Blackwood's work have been sealed or destroyed, and those who might have provided testimony have long since passed away. But the whispers persist, stories of bottles found in estate sales that seem to contain moving shadows, reports of photographers capturing impossible images of people without shadows, accounts of individuals who claim they can hear voices speaking in languages that don't exist. Perhaps shadows are exactly what science tells us. They are simple, optical phenomena with no consciousness or agenda. Or perhaps Dr. Blackwood discovered a truth that the world wasn't ready to accept. that the darkness we take for granted is anything but empty, and that some boundaries between the physical and metaphysical were never meant to be crossed. Next time you see your shadow stretching across the ground, ask yourself this question: is it really just the absence of light, or is it something more, something that has been watching, waiting, and whispering secrets that only the darkness knows? And remember, in a world where 17 souls may still be trapped in glass bottles, buried somewhere beneath our feet, perhaps it's better not to know the answer to that question. Sweet dreams.